Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We know that today we say, for example, Chinese people come from China, or people who have tanned skin and dark hair usually come from the Middle East, or for example, blonde people come from, for example, Germany, and black people come from Africa, or especially the middle of Africa, and your Arabs come from the Middle East, etc. But where do ginger people come from? How come there's no ginger country? Where did they originate from? Where did they come from? And on this video, inshallah, I will actually show you that gingers, or people with red hair, actually come from the Middle East, and mainly they come from Iran or Persia. That's right. Red-haired people or ginger people are the real Parsis or Farsis. They are the original Iranians. And this may sound really bizarre because there are almost none of them there today. But I can tell you, for example, from my own family, that some of my distant relatives, and also one of my close relatives, have red hair. Even though I don't, and most of us don't, but some of our relatives actually have red hair. So I know for a fact that it is actually true that Iranians used to have red hair. And inshallah, I will show you a lot of evidence on this and future videos. And not only that, but we will also look into the fact that blonde people also come from the Middle East. Inshallah, we will see that blonde people are also Middle Eastern. They're not Western Europeans or Americans. Obviously, we know they're not Americans, but they're not even Western Europeans, as they tell us. Both red-haired people and blonde people used to live in the Middle East. People with blue eyes, people with green eyes, they were all in the Middle East. And you might ask, so how did they end up in Europe or America? In fact, there are many videos about this right now. There are many theories, not regarding hair color and stuff, but regarding the orphan trains. Some people who have done research on Tartaria and the mud flood and orphan trains, they are theorizing that, these orphans, they're saying, where did they come from? Did they come from some of them are theorizing that they were produced in a factory, that these babies were like genetically modified or created through science and stuff. But this is the problem, that some of these conspiracy theories are still relying on the fake science of cloning and all this garbage that the media and the movies tell us, when in reality, where these orphans came from was from the Middle East. That's how they ended up in Europe and America. And Australia and elsewhere. They actually originate from the Middle East. Blonde people and red-haired people, both of them. And the blonde people are mainly in what we call, the Byzantine Empire, which was really the Roman Empire. It was the real Roman Empire. The Italian Roman Empire never existed. That's fake. The history of the Roman Empire that they tell us is a fake, is a lie. The real Rome or Rome was what they call the Byzantine Empire. And it's actually really funny because they tell us, the official history, they tell us that the Muslims had confused the Byzantines with the Romans, and that's why they wrongly used to call the Byzantines Rum or Rumi or Roman. But that's ridiculous, because why would the Muslims confuse the Byzantines with the Romans? Because the Muslims were in contact with the Byzantines. So if anything, the Muslims should have wrongly called the Roman Empire the Byzantine Empire, not called the Byzantine Empire the Roman Empire, because they were in contact with the Byzantines. They used to trade with them, talk to them, they had wars with them, they had peace deals with them, even according to official history. So why would the Muslims mistakenly call the Byzantines Roman when the Muslims were in contact with the Byzantines and not the European, the Italian Roman Empire? If Muslims were, they were both in the Middle East, then why would they confuse them? No, the truth is that modern history that they tell us, that the history that you learn in your school books, in your universities and television, is a lie, it's a fake. The truth is that Roman or Rumi simply means blonde people. And even the history of the Byzantine Empire is a fake history, but there is some truth to it, meaning that there really was a Rome in the Middle East, but it wasn't even a Roman Empire. The real Rumis were just blonde people. The people who were blonde were called Rumi. And it wasn't just, this Sufi Sheikh Rumi that they tell us about. They call him Jalal ad-Din Rumi. No, all the blonde people were called Rumi. it's interesting because today they try to tell us that Rumi came from Turkey, when in fact he came from Afghanistan. But I'll get into that later, inshallah. But let's begin from, let's go all the way to the beginning. So where's the evidence? And what am I even talking about? For those of you who are new to this topic, what am I talking about? Well, if you look at old photographs of the Western world from the early 1800s, you see that the cities, the towns, they were empty. There was almost no one there. And you occasionally see like a couple of people, and then later you see like one adult or two adults and a bunch of orphans. And the rest is just empty. There's almost no one else living there. The cities, and you see these amazing buildings, which even today they can't build. They can't build buildings like this. Today, all the buildings look really primitive and ugly, and they all they look like cardboard boxes. But buildings back then were, who built these buildings? How did these primitive people at that time build these amazing buildings? But not only that, it's not just that they were primitive according to the mainstream narrative. We see that in reality, they were even more primitive because they were just orphans. There were almost no one living there. And even if you go by the official narrative, how did people riding on horses and living in villages in wooden homes build buildings like this? Where did they get the technology from? Where did they get the material from? How did they build them without any roads and any machines or anything? How could they build buildings like this when they can't even build them today with modern technology? Maybe they can build, one average building like this, but there were thousands or millions of these buildings in the world, and they actually destroyed many of them. But anyway, the point is that when you look at these photographs, you can clearly see that there was a time when the majority of the people in the West were orphans. And when you look at all these pictures of orphans, and you start to see something really strange going on. Just look at this. This was the living condition of the orphans. When people were living in this condition, we're expected to believe that they built these amazing buildings and amazing cities. And yet this was where the orphans used to sleep in the West, in America and Europe. This was their condition when these so-called Victorian buildings were being built, supposedly. And in fact, they weren't built at that time. They were taken over. They were conquered. They were changed during that time. During the 1800s, they were changing the buildings. They were altering them. They actually turned some of the windows into doors, and I'll get into that later, inshallah. But when you look at these orphans, for example, here, for example, we see that these orphans, there were so few adults there at that time that they're actually taking care of younger orphans. The older orphans are taking care of the younger orphans. So just think about this, how few adults there must have been during that time for the older orphans to be taking care of the younger orphans. That means they had almost no nurses, or there must have been very, very few adults for this to have been the case. And these are some of the excuses that they tell us, and especially they told these orphans when they grew up. These are some of the lies that they told them at that time, and because they told so many people, some of these lies have actually survived to this day, meaning that people still remember them, and they think that this is the truth. But these are some of the things that they told these orphans, who were actually stolen from the Middle East in reality. But I'll get into that later, inshallah. But these are the narratives that they were given. One was that these were illegitimate children, meaning that their parents, their mothers, gave birth to them out of wedlock. Now remember that at that time in the past, we were told that Europeans were much more religious. They were much more, Europeans and Americans, they were much more conservative. So how come there were so many children being born out of wedlock? So, you see, their narrative contradicts itself. How come today there aren't as many orphans when there's so much adultery and fornication going on? But back then, when people were more religious, somehow there were all these orphans everywhere. And look at what it says here. It says, what happened next to the mothers who were successful in getting the hospital to take their babies is the hardest thing of all to discover, says Need. They melted out of the picture. They were not encouraged to visit their children or to try to keep up any kind of relationship with them. You know why? Because this story is a lie. The reason why these parents were not allowed to meet their children is that the real parents were actually all the way in the Middle East. They weren't Europeans, they weren't Americans. These were not children who were born out of wedlock. These were actually children of Muslim parents. And yeah, I actually tell you, these people with blonde hair and red hair, many of them were Muslims. And I'm going to show you something here. Look at this picture. You see all these children, orphan children, is an old picture. And you see the one on the right is wearing hijab. And you see, you always have the non-conformist. You know, like after 9/11, there was a lot of pressure on Muslim men to shave their beards and on Muslim women to take off their hijab, especially in like 2001, 2002. And people used to get attacked all the time. Muslim women used to get, and men used to get attacked, not just in the West, but even in the Middle East, for, you know, oh, you look like a terrorist, you look religious, you know, you're wearing hijab, you got a beard. So yeah, people used to get attacked all the time, verbally and physically. But there were always these non-conformists who said, you know, I don't care what you say about me, I'm gonna keep my beard, I'm gonna keep my hijab. And we see that one of these children is obviously, I think that she's a non-conformist, meaning that all the rest have gone along with the narrative, and she still remembers that her parents were Muslims, and she has decided to keep her hijab. So, you know, these were some of the children who weren't as young when they were taken away from their parents. They still remembered. So, like 4-year-old, 5-year-old, sometimes they remembered that their parents were Muslims, and they would keep their hijab in order to rebel against the the secret societies who had stolen them. Another excuse that they made for these orphans was the story of the Titanic. And there are many researchers who have actually proven that the whole Titanic story was a lie. It was fake. It never happened. And the old pictures of the Titanic are actually miniatures, and, you know, they're doll houses. They're not even real. But I don't want to get into that in this video. But basically, that's another story that we were told, that, oh, there was a Titanic, and the only when the ship was sinking, they put the children on the boats, but all the men and most of the women sunk under the they sunk with the ship. And so they told her, oh, your parents died on the Titanic, or your parents, your mother was a bad person and she gave birth to you out of wedlock, and that's why you don't have your parents anymore. You know, and another story is World War I and also World War II. During these wars, we're told that supposedly a lot of parents, for the sake of the safety of their children, because of they were afraid of the bombings by whichever side during the war, because they were afraid for the safety of their children, they put them on trains and they took their children away so that they won't get bombed. Now, this story makes absolutely no sense. Why would the children being away from their parents make them safe from the bombings? I mean, couldn't the parents gone with the children? I mean, did the parents want to get killed themselves? Did they want to be bombed? I mean, it makes no sense. I mean, for example, if you take children from one country, from the north to the south, what difference does it make? If the enemy is coming to bomb them, they're coming to bomb the country, they're not going to tell you where they're going to bomb. So they may bomb anyone, you see? But that's another stupid story that we're told, that many of these children were taken away from their parents for their safety during World War I and again during World War II. And this is the funny part of the story. They say that they never brought them back. They never brought them back to their parents. So they took the children from the parents and they never brought them back. I mean, who believes that? But these are the stupid stories that they told the children at that time, and some of them grew up and they remembered these stories and they thought that it was true, and they actually write books about it today. But it's not the case. You see, all these stories are lies. And these children were orphans who were brought from the Middle East, and even up until World War II, and even after World War II, because I know this from about my own family, that one of my aunts had red hair, and so they wanted to take her away from my parents, from my grandparents. And my grandfather, both my grandfathers actually used to work on these trains. They both worked at the train station, and because they had connections, they worked for these people. They were one of my grandfathers was allowed to keep his first daughter because she was his firstborn, his first daughter. He tried really hard to convince them to please let me keep at least my first child, and they agreed eventually that he can keep his first child, but every other red-haired child that my grandmother gave birth to was taken away from her. And she was only allowed to keep her black-haired children, meaning my other aunts and uncles. But I actually have relatives now that I don't know who they are or where they are right now, with red hair all across Europe or America or I don't know where. I actually have relatives that I don't know, aunts, and I'm not even talking about like ancestors, I'm talking about aunts and uncles. Because many of my grandmother gave birth to many children, and she said that, I don't know if maybe she was exaggerating, but she said that 10 of her children were gone during this time. And she was only allowed to keep her oldest one, her oldest red-haired child. And I also have another grandmother who was born with green eyes, and so the government wanted to take her away from my great-grandfather. And my great-grandfather refused to give her up, and he actually fought against the government of Iran. He fought against the king, and he got killed. But then my grandmother, who was only like 4 or 5 years old, I think she was 4 years old at the time, she escaped to the nearby village, and the villagers hid her from the government. The government were coming to take her. They killed her father, and when they came to take her away, they couldn't find her. The house was empty, and she managed to survive. And that's why I don't know anything about my grandmother's family. So she ended up actually becoming an orphan, like these orphan trains. She ended up as an orphan, but at least we know why. We know the reason why. She was old enough to remember. She was 4 years old, and she told the villagers there what had happened. And so yeah, and they did this just because she had green eyes. Because Iranians aren't supposed to have green eyes in their narrative, in their new narrative, after the reset, after the Novus Ordo Secularum, after the new secular order, the new secular narrative, the Darwinian narrative, the fake history and the fake evolution, all this, the fake science, the fake geography. After all that came about, these laws were passed. And the reason why this happened to my family quite recently is that my great-grandparents used to live in villages. You see, first they did this to the big cities. Then they, like in the 1700s, in the 1800s, or I should say the J700s. So first it was the big cities, then it was the small cities, then it was the towns, and finally they went after the villages. So that's why, because my great-grandparents lived in villages, that's why they were like the last to be gotten rid of. And also, they did this to some countries earlier than others. So it's not the same in all countries. And if you want proof of this, if anyone doesn't trust me, or you want actual proof, look at this map. This is a map of the Middle East. Okay? And what do you see? You see a blonde baby and a red-haired baby. And these babies are supposed to represent the people of the Middle East in this old antique map. We have some narrations today in our hadith books, in our history books and hadith books, in the real tarikh books, not the modern fake history, but in our old books of tarikh and hadith. You have narrations that say that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, used to have red hair. The Prophet himself had red hair. But we're told today that that's because people used to dye their hair. And we have some narrations that say this, that they try to make it fit with the modern narrative. So they say that, people used to dye their hair blonde and dye their hair red. The Prophet and his companions, so some narrations they say that they really had red hair, and some say that no, they used to dye their hair. But if they used to dye their hair, then how come these babies have red hair and blonde hair? I mean, did babies dye their hair? So we can clearly see that narrative is a lie, and the Prophet really did have red hair. And there were also a lot of people with blonde hair. And this is why the Quran actually praises the Romans in the Quran. And this is one of the things that confuses a lot of people. They say, why does the Quran praise the Romans, the Rumis? If the Romans or Rumis were the enemies of the Muslims, then why does the Quran say that when they won, when they had a victory against their enemies, the Muslims celebrated? Today we're told that they preferred the Romans, the Rumis, over their enemies. They tell us that the Romans were Christians and they were fighting against Zoroastrians, and because Islam is closer to Christianity than Zoroastrianism, the Muslims preferred their Roman Christian enemies over their Zoroastrian enemies. But that doesn't make any sense, because the Quran actually says that the Muslims celebrated. Why would you celebrate just because you prefer one group over the other? You know, if there are two groups of people and you hate them both and you're at war against them both, you're not going to celebrate if one side wins. You may prefer one side over the other, but you're not going to celebrate. But the Quran says the Muslims celebrated when the Romans won. So this shows that the Romans were actually Muslims. The blonde Romans, and that's what Roman actually means. Roman or Rumi actually means blonde. It does not mean what they tell us about the Roman Empire. The Rumis were actually a tribe. They were Bani Ishaq. They were sons of Isaac. And they had blonde hair. And they were some of the earliest Muslims. Some of the earliest converts to Islam were blonde people, Rumi people. And there are many places in the Middle East that are actually named after Rumis. Like they say, you know, the Rumi city, the Rumi town. There are many places like that in my country, Iran. But it's interesting that in the past 40 years, after Khomeini and Khamenei took over, they started changing the names of those places. But some people in Iran still use the old names. They refuse to, you know, use the modern names. That, you know, they started naming everything after Khomeini and Khamenei and their family and relatives. But in the past, they were called Rumi, the Rumi area, the Rumi bridge, the Rumi this, because there were a lot of blonde people living in these areas in the past, but now they're trying to hide it. The government of Iran, as I said before, the government of Iran is 100% part of the narrative. They're totally part of the, you know, satanic Illuminati. There's no difference between Iran and America and Russia and Saudi Arabia and Israel and China and so on. They're all the same. And this here is a map of Persia, and as you can see, the Persian man has red beard, red hair. And they all have red hair. All the Persians have red hair. That's what Persians used to look like. Red-haired people. Ginger people. And these are all on antique maps. And here we see a blonde mummy in Iran. That's right. A blonde mummy. And here we see another map of the Middle East. And we see the Muslim ruler with a galansuwa and beard and turban. And the woman next to him has blonde hair. And today we're told that, oh, no, this is because the Muslims used to steal European women and rape them, and they became sex slaves. But if she's a sex slave, then how come she's wearing a crown? Look at her head. She's wearing a crown on her head. So how could she be a slave? Why is she wearing a crown if she's a slave? And some of you may be asking, then how come she's not wearing hijab? Because these rulers that came later, these Abbasids and Umayyads, they were not very religious. They used to like bully other people in the name of religion, but they themselves didn't follow the religion. Similar to many of the Middle Eastern governments today, many of the, like, you know, like Iran pretends to be religious, but like we look at the Saudis, for example, many of these emirates that you find in the Middle East, you see that, you know, their wives don't wear hijab. They don't follow, you know, the basic laws of Islam, but at the same time they claim to be an Islamic government. You see this a lot in a lot of Middle Eastern governments. A lot of the kings, you know, like even Iran before 1979, the king said he's a Muslim, but his wife didn't wear hijab. Okay, so that's actually very common in the Middle East. But you can clearly see that she's not a slave because she's wearing a crown on her head. So she's either a queen or a princess, and she's blonde. And when you look at the places in the Muslim world that have gone under the most, you know, vicious bombings and massacres and ethnic cleansing, as they call it, and there's a reason why they call it ethnic cleansing. They're trying to cleanse anything that does not agree with the narrative. You know, they're trying to get rid of anyone that doesn't go along with the narrative. And you look at the places that have got through the worst, you know, bombings and wars and invasions. They are Chechnya, Afghanistan, and Palestine. And all these places, until recently, had a lot of what they call, you know, white Muslims with red hair and blonde hair. And I mean, Chechnya, I mean, it's obvious. I mean, almost all of them are very, very white. But even Afghanistan, you know, Rumi was from Afghanistan. And he was called Rumi because he was blonde, not because he was from the Byzantine Empire. He was actually from Afghanistan. We're told today that he was from Turkey, but the Afghans say that no, he was actually from Afghanistan. And so there were a lot of blonde people in Afghanistan. There were a lot of red-haired people in Afghanistan, and still are, but not as many as they used to be. And And the other one is Palestine, and of course Palestine. We know how the Zionists, massacred the Palestinians, and some people are asking, how come today they're not doing it as much as they used to? I mean, in the past we were just killing all the Palestinians, but now they created this fake, Palestinian government of Hamas, this fake resistance who are supported by Russia and Iran and Saudi Arabia and America. They're completely fake, and they're not trying to kill off all the Palestinians anymore. Have you noticed that? Why were they massacring them in the past, but not so much today? Even though today they pretend like, oh no, Hamas versus Israel, but it's all fake. You know that Hamas is fake. Hamas is controlled by Israel, America, and Russia and Iran. They're all things. But the point is, why did they do it in the past then? Why did they kill so many Palestinians in the past? Why did they destroy so many Palestinian cities, but they're not doing it anymore? I mean, now Palestine is very small, but they're not trying to. Now Israel can easily, wipe out Palestine, because Palestine is now smaller and weaker than ever. So why didn't they just go and finish them off? Because that's not part of their agenda. You see, the places that they were attacking in the past were people who didn't fit their narrative. There were many people in Palestine that didn't go along with the official narrative. There were many people who were very tall, and I'll get into that later why they were tall, because they didn't take the injection and so on. But I'll get into that later more, and inshallah. But most of all, you see that there were certain areas in Palestine which were actually called Red Town or Red City, and those were the places that were bombed the most and massacred the most and murdered the most. Red-haired Palestinians. And today they just said, they were called red for some other reason, but because some of those people survived, they couldn't kill every single last one of them. They killed most of them. But because some of them actually survived, and because of the Palestinian resistance they managed to survive, you can actually see to this day there are some of them still in Palestine. And look at this guy. If I told you that this guy is a European or an American or an Australian, you would totally believe me, or an Irish person. You think, yeah, this guy is white and he has red hair. But no, this guy is Palestinian. Yeah, this guy you're looking at right here, he's a Palestinian. And now they're in the small minority, but there used to be a lot of them, and the Zionists massacred them, and they were in the city that was, the cities that they lived, some of them had so many red-haired people that they were literally called, Ginger City, or Red City, or Ginger Town, or Red Town. And those were the places that the Zionists carried out the biggest massacres, and that's what they called ethnic cleansing. See, that's what ethnic cleansing was really about. It's all about the narrative. They have this ugly, boring, crap narrative that they tell us in schools. This horrible, boring, Darwinian, rubbish history. And it's so important for them to bore us to death with that garbage school narrative that they're willing to murder thousands of people just so that they can make their stupid history more believable. I mean, that's how disgusting and evil these people are. They actually... so they murder people, and then they mess with the rest of the people psychologically and spiritually. Like, they try to make you think that everything is part of this slow, boring history that they tell us. Everything happens slowly, like evolution. But everything else, they tell us that cities were built very slowly. They try to slow you down because they don't like spontaneous people who take quick action. They want you to be slow and don't do anything, and maybe if we vote for the other party after 1,000 years we can make some changes. Obama made 1 or 2 changes, that's enough, that's all we need, and Trump made a few changes, that's all we need. We don't need to change everything and build amazing things and bring about real change. We just have to slowly go along with that. That's what they're trying to do to you. But so I mean, that's how sadistic they are, that they murder people, destroy people's lives, orphan children, and then they bore those children in schools and spiritually suffocate those children with this garbage, boring Darwinian science and boring rubbish fake history and boring rubbish fake geography, which is all fake. It's all fake, and that's why it's boring. As I said before, real history is actually interesting. Real religion is interesting. Real geography is interesting. The reason why you get so bored in school is because they're teaching you garbage. You see, because children are born with the fitra, they are born with the ability to feel the truth. That's why you get so bored in school. You're right. When you're a kid and you're told, oh, so you're wrong to be bored. Oh, it's all interesting. Science is so interesting. History is so interesting. And you say, no, it's boring. You are right. When you're a child, you're right. You're following your heart. You're following your fitra. You're born with the fitra. You're right not to be interested in that garbage that they teach you in schools. The teachers are wrong. You're actually right. You're right to be bored. You shouldn't be studying that garbage. The truth is interesting because you're born with the fitra. You're born with the fitra is an inclination that Allah has placed within us to be interested in or inclined towards the truth. And some of you may be asking, oh, well, religious stuff is boring too. Yeah. If you go to one of these fake mosques or, to these fake preachers or whatever, fake religions, yeah, you get bored there too, because fake religions are also boring. The fake versions of the religions that they've given us are also boring. The more truth there is in something, the more interesting it is. And look at this here. This is a helmet of Mikhail Romanov. Roman. So the person who wore this was known as a Roman. Okay, and today we're told that he was a Christian. But when you look at the helmet, you see Arabic writings. And it's not just some random Arabic writings either. It's actually directly from the Quran. It's actually quoting from the Quran. It's actually a surah from the Quran on the helmet. So this again shows that the Romans were Muslims. And now we get to the issue of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the companions of the Prophet. For example, we have the hadith in Sahih Bukhari that says that the Prophet actually had red hair. And we also have al-Mu'minin Aisha radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet, was called Humayra. You know what Humayra means? It means red. His wife was called red. And today we're told that the reason why she was called red is because she was so black that she was red. If that makes any sense. She was so black that she was red. Does that make sense? And regarding Iranians, we look at old Muslim books, like many old Muslim books. They say that the Iranians were red. But then in the case of the Iranians, they say that they were so white that they were red. So they say that Aisha was so black that she was called red, and Iranians were so white that they were called red because they were whiter than the Arabs. That's what he tells. I mean, it makes no sense at all. So black is red and white is red. No, red is referring to the hair color, just as Ban al-Asfar, which means the yellow people, the sons of the yellow, literally means the sons of the yellow. The yellow people means people who had blonde hair. And so red people means people with red hair. And so al-Mu'minin Aisha radiallahu anha, just like the Prophet, had red hair. The Prophet had red hair, his wife al-Mu'minin Aisha radiallahu anha had red hair. And the Iranians also had red hair. The Persians, the Parsis also had red hair. And inshallah we get into that issue later regarding the Quraysh, the tribe of the Prophet. The Quraysh were actually a red-haired people, and they were actually descendants of Kurosh or Cyrus, and who was actually Zulqarnain. But inshallah I will get to that in future videos. But that's who the Quraysh really were. They were an eel. The eel, when the Quran says Ilaf Quraysh, Ilaf, the eels were people who were constantly traveling. So they didn't stay in one location. So in case you say, what were the Quraysh doing in Arabia if they were descendants of Cyrus, who was Persian? The answer is that they were in constant migration. That's why the Quran calls them Ilaf Quraysh. Ilaf, the eels are people who are in constant migration, and back then there were no visas or passports or anything, so people could travel anywhere they wanted pretty much. At least, even if some kingdom wouldn't allow them in, they wouldn't allow them into the city, but people could travel, move throughout the jungles and the mountains. No one back then claimed to own the deserts and the mountains. People could travel pretty much anywhere they wanted. It's only today when they have these fake borders, and the borders are mostly fake anyway. I mean, they're just to prevent people from moving around too much, because they don't want that. The controllers don't want you to move around too much. They want you to stay in one place. And in fact, we still have these eels in Iran, but they only move about in Iran. They don't go to other countries like they used to. They just go from the east of one city to the west of that city, or from the north to the south. But in the past, they used to move from Persia to Arabia backwards. They would go they would go to almost anywhere, because there were no restrictions. You see. And these people were the Quraysh, and they were and the reason why they were called Quraysh is that they were descendants of Gurosh, because Kurosh, which is the Farsi word, Iranian word, in Arabic is called Gurosh, okay, or Gurosh, and that's where we get Quraysh or Quraysh from. And Kurosh himself, according to Greek historians, was a descendant of Ishmael or Ismail alayhi salam. So I'm not saying that the Prophet wasn't a descendant of Ismail alayhi salam. I'm saying that he was, but through Kurosh or Gurosh. And that's why he was called, his tribe was called the tribe of Quraysh. The Quraysh were the descendants of Gurosh, and they had red hair. And you might say, how come some of these, reptilian people, they have red hair? But the Quraysh were two types. There were two types of Quraysh. There were Bani Hashim and Bani Umayyah. The Bani Umayyah, many of them were reptilians. And this is actually stated by Nu'aym ibn Hammad. He narrates that the Prophet called Marwan a reptilian, and Marwan was also from Quraysh. So the Prophet was from Quraysh, but there was also someone from the Umayyad Quraysh who was called Marwan. And when he was born, the Prophet called him reptilian, son of reptilian. So he didn't mean it metaphorically, because some people might say, oh, this is metaphorical. No, because he called him a reptilian and the son of a reptilian. Now, why would the Prophet metaphorically insult a baby? No, he wasn't insulting the baby. The baby was literally a reptilian. So there was a reptilian baby born called Marwan, and his father was also a reptilian. And Marwan later became the ruler. According to history, Marwan later became the ruler. And the Umayyads rebelled against the Hashemites. The Prophet was a Hashemite Qurayshi. But then the Umayyads, who were also from Quraysh, they rebelled against the Hashemites, and eventually Marwan actually became the ruler. So the reptilians eventually took over. They became the rulers. And I believe that many of these red-haired reptilian people we see in Hollywood today and in many Western royal families, these are actually the descendants of Marwan. And of course many of them change their hair color and they pretend not to be ginger, not to have red hair. But many of these super rich, super rich red-haired ginger people are actually the descendants of Marwan. So there were reptilian, red-haired or ginger people, and there were also Hashemites. And Hashemites were the family of the Prophet. Okay? And so there are two types of red-haired people. And it's not just red-haired people who are reptilians. There are also reptilian Indians, reptilian blondes, reptilian Chinese, reptilian... anyone who has intercourse with the descendants of Iblis, then their children and descendants will become reptilians. So they exist in every nation, although they originate from Hyperborea. The reptilians, Iblis himself lives in Hyperborea, or the so-called North Pole. Although the North Pole that they show you on TV is fake, they're actually showing you Fritzland, which is actually Friesland. It's actually another play on words, like New Zealand. New Zealand, land of news. Fritzland is the frozen land. So when they show you the North Pole on TV, they're showing you a fake North Pole. The real North Pole has not frozen. The real North Pole is actually the headquarters of the world empire. The emperor of this world is living in the North Pole, and it's not what they show you on TV. And the North Pole is actually called Hyperborea. The real North Pole that they never show you is called Hyperborea, and that's where Satan lives, or the actual, Iblis, the leader of the Satans, the leader of the Shayateen. And that's why the descendants of Iblis actually came from Hyperborea. They went to Russia, and then from Russia to India, and then from India to other places. And they used to be called Moguls. And that's why today they use the term media moguls in America. So why are the Americans using an Indian term? Because they are the descendants of those reptilians who were in India. You see? But this, and the people of, I said before, the people of what we call India today, they used to be called Hindustanis, or Hindus. And that had nothing to do with the religion. The people were called Hindus, okay? The term Indian was used because Indian equals 33. The reptilians used the term Indian. They changed the name Hindustani or Hindu into Indian because it equals 33. and they later moved to Iran and to Europe, and that's when they became known as the Indo-Europeans, and they invaded America and they became known as the Indian Americans. And I'm not talking about the Indian Americans that you're thinking of. I'm talking about the real history. I'm not talking about the fake narrative. They give us fake definitions of all these terms, like Indo-European, Indian American. They've given us fake definitions for all of them. But in reality, these were actually the reptilians who invaded India or Hindustan, and then they invaded Iran, and then they changed the name of Iran from Pers to Persia after they converted Iran by force to Shiism. It was Pers, and then it became Persia. That's where we get the term Persia from. It's Persia, okay? Because they made Pers or Pars or Fars. They made that country Shia. They actually made that country. They separated it from the original rulers. But I don't want to get into that here. But anyway, when they took over that land, the south of Tartaria, they called it Persia. And Pers was just a province of Tartaria in the past. And so anyway, they took over Pers and made it into Persia, and then they took over, they went further into the west and eventually took over Europe, and that's where we get the term Indian American. And the Indian company. Indian does not mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean what it means today. And I don't want people to confuse and think that I'm talking about all the Indian people anyone who is born in India. No, in the past, the reptilians were called Indians. Today, Indian means someone who's born in the country of India. But in the past, it was a term that was used for the reptilians, even the white ones. Whatever hair color they had, whatever skin color they had, they were known as Indians. And they were actually small people, very short people. But then they injected other people and made us all short. They made us all in their own image and likeness. And then they decided to repopulate the earth after the reset. And they tried to make man in their own image and likeness. And these were the false gods, the Elohim, the false gods. And they changed the scriptures. They gave people this fake Bible today. That's why the book of Genesis today is actually about the reset. And then they attacked the Palestinians, the Philistines, because they were too tall. And that's what the Bible says, kill all the Palestinians, kill all the Philistines, because they're giants. Kill them all, kill their babies, kill them all. That actually happened recently, not that long ago. You see, the Bible is not as old as they tell you. The book of Genesis and all that has been recently... remember, the Quran mentions the Torah and the Injil. It never mentions the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is never mentioned in the Quran or in the Hadith. Even in the entire Hadith books, you have so many Hadith books. None of them mention the book of Genesis. There was no book of Genesis. There was the Torah and the Injil. The book of Genesis is a fake Torah. The first 5 books of the Bible that they tell us are the Torah, they're actually a fake Torah. But that's another topic for another video, inshallah. But basically that's what happened. They took over the world, and then they made other people shorter, so that we can't tell them apart unless sometimes their eyes shift and become reptilian. But of course, then they started wearing shades and sunglasses and then contact lenses and so on to cover up the fact that they're reptilians. But you could in the past you could easily turn them apart, because they used to be a lot shorter than us. The Insans used to be a lot taller than the Bani Iblis. And inshallah we'll continue this on part 2. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.